What is up, DS3TV? We are back for another video. This one's Kings and Generals, and this one is Japanese invasion of Korea. So this one's gonna be pretty good. And yeah. Also subscribe to the channel. I want to get 1,000 subscribers by Valentine's Day. And yeah, also put videos down in the comment section that you want me to react to, cause yeah, I am always open to taking suggestions. So yeah, let's get into it. And without further ado, play.
Japanese armies of previously unheard of sizes had forced the Korean king and his government far to the north. Reinforcements from Hideyoshi were ready for transport, and the country was almost conquered. However, not everything was going Japan's way. We previously discussed Yi Sun-shin's stunning naval campaigns during 1592, and the impact they began to have on the logistics of the enemy. As 1593 began, the strain would become ever more severe until reaching breaking point. Welcome to our third video on the Japanese invasions of Korea and how the liberation of the peninsula began. While the victories Admiral Yi Sun-shin had won at sea prevented the entry of his Japanese foes into the Yellow Sea, through which they sought to reinforce and resupply their armies on land, Korean ground forces behind the Japanese lines were doing the same. In the countryside and wilderness of the provinces, guerrilla armies began to form almost immediately, reacting to the cruelty they and their countrymen experienced at the hands of the enemy. Resistance leaders such as Ko Kyung-myung, Cho Hon and Kwak Cheu set up ambushes to trap enemy troops and preyed on vulnerable Japanese supply barges that were using Korea's rivers for transport. These actions further hampered the logistics of Toyotomi Hideyoshi's conquering army, in much the same way Admiral Yi was doing at sea. Motivated partly by patriotism and partly by a desire to raise the social status of their kin, from the Yalu River in the north to the Naktong Delta in the south, an estimated 22,000 irregular fighters and 84,500 regular soldiers joined the fight as guerrilla warriors in 1592, among them 8,000 Buddhist monks. In November of 1592, Korean guerrilla forces contributed to the successful defense of Chunji, a battle which caused many Japanese casualties and humiliated the daimyo generals. Most crucially, all of the chaos behind Hideyoshi's lines was giving Korea time, and time was exactly what Korea needed. The situation was about to become a lot worse for the Japanese when, in late 1592, Ming China finally began its intervention. An initial Chinese expeditionary force of 3,000 troops, under the command of the reckless Zhu Chengshun, was ordered to take Pyongyang, but was destroyed when it became trapped and outnumbered inside the city. While this victory against the Ming forces made the Japanese optimistic at first, the samurai commanders now knew that the Chinese would be back soon and in massive numbers. Worried about this and the vulnerable state of Pyongyang, Konishi Yukinaga went south to Seoul in order to meet with his supreme commander, Ukita Hideiie, so that they might discuss these urgent matters. January of 1593 was to prove Japanese anxieties justified in that regard. After finally crushing the Ningxia revolt, Chinese commander Li Rusong cautiously led a large army of Ming troops into Korea, wisely using scouts and spies to gather intelligence on Japanese positions. After some minor skirmishes, his forces approached Pyongyang on February 5th. An initial Japanese sortie from the gates was crushed by a feigned retreat, but it was clear that recapturing the city would present a massive challenge. Pyongyang enjoyed a strong defensive position, flanked to the east by the Taedong River and northwest by the Potong River. Moreover, it possessed some of Korea's most formidable walls, which had been continuously reinforced throughout the centuries, forming a crude, elongated triangle lying between the two rivers, within which were 6 gates. While the entrances along the Taedong River were left lightly defended, each of the 4 landward gates was garrisoned by 2,000 Japanese soldiers. Konishi Yukinaga and 2,000 elite bodyguard troops were deployed on Mount Moranbong, a 70-meter high fortified vista from which a commanding view of surroundings could be had. Overall, it was the roughly 15,000 men of the 1st contingent who defended Pyongyang. Li Rusong's 43,000-strong imperial army had been further swollen by many thousands of Koreans and 5,000 warrior monks. He set up his own headquarters on high ground west of the Potong River, personally commanding 9,000 troops. Around the city, the general distributed various detachments under his subordinates to assault the various gates. 10,000 soldiers under Zhang Shijie were set up opposite the Chilsong Gate, 11,000 under Yang Yuan formed up facing the Potong Gate, and a further 10,000 under Li Rubo prepared to assault the Hangu Gate. Finally, 9,000 Koreans under their native commanders Yi Il and Kim Eun-so were ordered to the Chongyang Gate. The Chinese cannons, capable of firing large stones over 2 kilometers, were distributed evenly around the siege lines under heavy guard. After an attempt to assassinate Konishi Yukinaga failed, the assault began. Spearheading the assault were 3,000 warrior monks, capable warriors under the command of Hu Zhong, a master monk. On the morning of February 6, 15...
I always thought the monks didn't fight at all, but I guess they did because, you know, they're obviously in the military here, but I guess when they feel like, you know, that their land is threatened and there's nothing else to fight, you know, like nothing else to do, you know, then fight, I guess they feel like you have to, because I was always under the impression that they just did not fight. They were very peaceful people.
In 1993, these brave religious warriors advanced up the northern slope of Mount Moranbong, attempting to scale the hill walls. In the face of withering arquebus fire from the Japanese on the fortifications, they suffered hundreds of casualties, but persevered nonetheless. As the defenders began to tire in the late afternoon, the monks were joined by a Chinese unit under Wu Weizhong, whose troops began to scale Mount Moranbong from the west. This contingent began to breach the area, streaming into the mountain behind Yukinaga's lines. All of a sudden, he was surrounded, and there was a danger he would be killed. At that moment, So Yoshitomo, a compatriot of Yoshinaga, led a counterattack from the main city and broke the Chinese encirclement on Mount Moranbong, allowing the remnants of Yukinaga's 2,000-strong guard to retreat. That evening, the Japanese abandoned the mountain, instead taking up positions in the recently constructed citadel, a construction of primitive earthworks. The next morning, Li Rusong ordered a general assault on Pyongyang with all forces engaged. As the first blast of cannon fire sounded, the general advanced at the head of his troops, only to be met with a storm of arquebus fire, rocks, arrows, and boiling water. The Ming cannons continuously battered the walls and gates of Pyongyang, aiming to soften them up. At the same time, incendiary bombs and fire arrows were loosed into the city itself, causing chaos, setting fire to buildings and even the forest outside of the city. Under the hail of projectiles, Chinese and Joseon casualties mounted, forming mounds of corpses which their comrades climbed upon to advance. To further stiffen his men's resolve, Li Rusong publicly killed a deserting soldier and then offered 5,000 ounces of silver to any brave man who would breach the walls first. With the unbearable pressure of artillery bombardment and the infantry assault, in addition to the employment of the famous cloud ladders of Chinese siege warfare, the defenses broke. The Chilsong Gate and the surrounding wall collapsed, allowing Ming troops and surviving warrior monks inside. Meanwhile, at the shattered Potong Gate, Luo Shangji was one of the first to enter the city, swinging his halberd. Now under intense pressure, the defensive ring along the walls of Pyongyang fell apart, resulting in a Japanese withdrawal to the inner citadel. This hastily constructed fortification was apparently constructed with holes in its side for arquebusiers to fire through, and which caused it to look like a beehive. The sophisticated Chinese officers, looking with scorn at the primitive and barbarian citadel, immediately ordered an assault in massed ranks. This proved to be a dreadful mistake. Japanese troops fired volley after volley of arquebus shots into the tightly packed Ming and Korean soldiers, causing massive casualties and breaking the assault's momentum. When Yukinaga saw some enemies retreating from the city altogether, he led a sortie from the citadel in an attempt to break the siege, but was methodically driven back by concentrated Chinese cannon fire. As daylight waned, the Japanese were still in control of the inner fortress, but were badly bloodied. Li Rusong decided to pull his men back for the night so that they could rest. It didn't matter, as he would launch a devastating attack the next day. Inside the citadel, Yukinaga held a war council. It was quickly decided their position was untenable, and the Japanese decided to retreat. Under the cover of darkness, the entire remaining garrison quietly withdrew through the Changyong Gate and across the frozen Taedong River. According to Samurai Yoshino Jingozemon, who was present during the retreat, wounded men were routinely abandoned, while those exhausted men simply crawled along the road. Yukinaga's men hoped to rest at a communication fort at Pungsan, but it had been abandoned after its commander assumed Yukinaga had already been annihilated. This Ming-dominated victory at Pyongyang was a change in momentum. It was now Li Rusong's army that advanced, and the Japanese who were in a headlong retreat. Nevertheless, the Japanese 6th Contingent under Kobayakawa Takekage managed to lure Li into a trap, defeating his army at the Battle of Pyeokjiek. This would prove to be one of the biggest pitched battles of the invasion, and one which the Chinese general only narrowly escaped before withdrawing his army north to recover. Having heard of the Ming victories in the north and at Pyongyang, a gifted Korean general known as Kwon Yul marched 2,300 troops to garrison the fortress of Hangju, situated on a hill 13 kilometers north of Seoul. The delay caused by Li Rusong's tactical defeat gave the Japanese some breathing room and allowed Ukita Hideie to march straight at Hangju with 30,000 soldiers, including the reconstituted forces of Yukinaga who had fled Pyongyang. They would quickly crush the minor irritation that was Kwon Yul's tiny force, or so they thought. At 6 AM on the 14th of March 1593, Ukita's army encircled Hangju and marched up the slopes leading to it from all directions. Unfortunately, the Koreans were waiting and ready for them. Darkinchments, Kwon Yul's forces sent a barrage of bowfire, arquebus shots, delayed action mortar bombs, rocks, and even tree trunks down on the attackers. Most infamous were the Korean Hwacha,
Hwacha organ gun armed with arrows and rockets developed in the 15th century, in 15th century Korea.
Medieval rocket launchers capable of loading up to 100 steel-tipped rockets. Japan's numerical superiority paid off, and the Koreans were forced back to the second defensive line, but their artillery caused devastating casualties in the massed Japanese waves. 9 attacks were made in total, and all 9 attacks were repelled. Overall, some sources claim 10,000 attackers ended up dead or wounded. Outnumbered by more than 10 to 1, Kwon Yul had gained victory. This remarkable triumph prompted the Chinese commander Li Rusong to once again move south. Having been despondent after his prior defeat against the Japanese, his huge Ming army now advanced south once again. In Seoul, the situation was horrible for the Japanese soldiery. Frostbite, starvation and disease had worn down the expeditionary army to around 53,000 total troops from its original 150,000. and it was clear that operations would need to cease for the time being. The remaining armies of Japan decided on a southward retreat to their coastal fortress at Busan, and the Chinese army liberated Seoul on May 19th. After this, logistical constraints and a cautious approach meant that the war descended into a stalemate, with neither side making any decisive movements. Diplomacy also took place during this unenforced truce, and Li Rusong sent envoys to meet with the daimyo generals in Busan, discussing topics such as troop withdrawal from the provinces and assigning blame for the war. Nevertheless, this was not an indication that Japan was militarily spent, and the generals now began to prepare a punitive destruction of Chinju. Hideyoshi's forces had failed to take the strongly fortified city in 1592, much to their humiliation and dishonor, and they would now avenge that loss. So, despite negotiating with the Ming Chinese at the same time, Hideyoshi sent the order to wipe Chunji off the map. Having heard of the Japanese plans, the Koreans had managed to assemble around 4,000 defenders in the city, ready to defend it to the death. On the 20th of July 1593, Supreme Commander Ukita Hideiie arrived outside the city with an army 90,000 men strong, swollen by recent reinforcements from the homeland. To the western edge of the city, Kanishi Yukinaga commanded 26,000 men, while his rival Kato Kiyomasa led 25,000 to the north. On the eastern flank of Chinju was Ukita Hideiie himself, with 17,000 troops under his leadership. Behind these assault forces was a ring of Japanese troops facing outward, to guard against any possible Ming assault on the siege lines. Furthermore, the besieging army placed contingents on the hills near the city in order to repel any reinforcements that came to relieve Chinju. To the northwest, Kobayakawa Takekage, the victor of Pyeokjaek, held authority over 8,700 troops, while Mori Hidimoto was stationed to the northeast with 13,000. Finally, Kikawa Hiroie had several thousand more across the Nam River to clean up any trouble to the city's south. On July 21st, the day was taken up by Japanese attempts to drain the newly built moat outside the city. Outer sections of the dikes were destroyed, and the channel was filled with rocks, earth and brushwood. The next day, this set the stage for a general attack on the landward side of the city. Using scaling ladders to storm the walls, Japanese troops fought fiercely and almost penetrated the city's defenses, but clever Korean use of artillery and fire arrows drove them back. As the 23rd dawned, a large and static siege tower was constructed in order to facilitate observation and arquebus fire into the city. However, again this was not successful, as destructive Korean cannon fire shot the towers to pieces one by one. Things seemed to be looking better for the defenders when a local army marched towards Chinju from the east in an attempt to relieve it. However, it was quickly pushed away by Hidimoto's northeast rearguard, leaving the city to its fate. The day after this, on July 25th, Hideiie sent a message into the castle, calling Kim Chonil, the garrison commander, to surrender. The Supreme Commander received no reply. Japanese forces tried again on the 26th. This time a series of tortoise-shell wagons with boarded roofs were constructed, providing protection for advancing troops, while sappers mined foundation stones from the ramparts. It made some progress, but this assault was pushed back when bundles of combustibles dropped off the walls were set alight, burning the protective shells. Nevertheless, it was becoming clear that the garrison was running out of things to throw at Hideie's army. Undaunted by the previous failure, Kato Kiyomasa ordered that new tortoise wagons were to be readied, and this time fireproofed by covering them with ox hide. On the 27th,
my next question is, oxhide is fireproof?
a new attack began, which focused on the cornerstones of the northeastern section of the wall. During the day, a heavy rainstorm broke out, which undermined the foundations, eventually collapsing this pressured section. Taking advantage of the breach, Japanese troops began to storm the city through the gap. Korean resistance collapsed almost immediately after this. Kim Chon-il, observing events from a tower in the center of Chinju, decided to commit suicide rather than surrender to his enemy. This was the end of Chinju. Terrified civilians and soldiers alike attempted to flee a brutal ensuing massacre by jumping into the Nam River, but were cruelly cut down on the far bank by Kikawa's troops. When the chaos was over, Japanese records claim that 20,000 heads were taken in total, while Korean annals claim 60,000 died at Chinju, a testament to Japanese barbarism. The Nam River flowed red with blood that night, and its banks were choked with headless corpses as far as the eye could see. The triumph of Japanese fight against Chinju changed nothing, as they were soon forced to retreat back to the chain of coastal fortresses they controlled in the south, known as Wejo. Negotiations began, a ceasefire was imposed, and a Ming emissary was sent to Japan to discuss terms with Toyotomi Hideyoshi. Gradually, daimyo and their men started to return to the islands. To the north, the Chinese also withdrew their expeditionary force home. Though peace talks would continue for years after this, and the first invasion of Korea was essentially over, the war was not done. Our story will continue, so make sure you're subscribed and have pressed the bell button. Please consider liking, commenting.
Well, that was a good video, and yeah. So I want to kind of start back watching Kings and Generals again because I haven't been watching them lately, and why not start with their newest video? So it was good to see. It's like I like how their videos are better and better as the years go on. Like, cause you can tell from when we first started watching them and and how the videos when we were watching their older videos, you can tell it's a major difference to how it is now. And yeah, so also talk to you guys in the next video, and also subscribe to the channel. Want to get 1,000 subscribers by Valentine's Day, and yeah, talk to you guys in the next video. Peace.